Protecting farm workers from pesticides. Eichmann David highlights a new report and hears from a local expert on why enough is not being done.
A new report from Farm Worker Justice and the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law and Graduate School says compliance with workplace safety for farm workers who are exposed to pesticides is lacking. Lori Baranovan is the director of Vermont Law and Graduate School Center for Agricultural and Food Systems and a professor of law. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now let's jump right in. What has this report found that's not happening?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a tricky question because generally one sort of major finding that the report made was that it's difficult to monitor compliance. And I should say, to take a step back, the report was focused on the worker protection standard specifically. And the worker protection standard is administered by the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and sets essentially the workplace standards for pesticide exposures for farm workers. So it's pretty specifically focused on one threat to farm worker safety in the workplace. And generally speaking, it's difficult to identify rates of compliance based on reporting and based on the fact that farm workers aren't often disclosing whether there are workplace hazards or whether they're being exposed to pesticides for fear of retaliation. One big thing that was easy to figure out is training. So there are required trainings for workers on different pesticides, and that's relatively easy to monitor. And so that was one big thing that the report found, where a lot of people were out of compliance.
Now, focusing on Vermont updated its pesticide regulations for the first time in 30 years to get in line with those federal standards you just mentioned. What is causing a lack of compliance here locally?
I think there's a lot of different reasons that there's a lack of compliance. One really interesting one that the report found, and I think this is probably likely true in Vermont, just given the size of farms in Vermont. The federal landscape is a little confusing because you have two different agencies that regulate workplace safety for farm workers. So you have the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and then you have the EPA that deals with pesticide exposure. And under the federal laws that deal with OSHA, if you have a farm of a certain size, you're exempted from OSHA's federal regulations. And so what the report found was that a lot of small farmers mistakenly believe that they are also exempted from the EPA's regulations and don't have to comply with them. So that was one really interesting finding from the report related to compliance.
Kind of going off that with compliance, where do advocates want to see changes and who's responsible for enforcing those changes when it comes to compliance?
Yeah, so do you mean compliance in Vermont specifically or compliance federally?
Let's focus on Vermont.
Yeah, so I would say some of the big issues that came up in Vermont, advocates were really focused with this new round of regulations that came out in Vermont related to pesticide exposures. Advocates were really concerned that for some of the most dangerous pesticides and, classes of pesticides generally, that they wanted to see applicators or, operations that are using pesticides actually put into place some sort of plan that would phase out the use of pesticides and would require operators or applicators to come up with an integrated pest management plan where essentially the use of pesticides and the use of very dangerous pesticides would be a measure of last resort. And so that was something that didn't wind up in the regulations, and mostly because the Department of Agriculture felt that it would be difficult to figure out how to measure compliance with that, and then it would be hard for them to administer and enforce that.
Lori Baranovan, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you so much.